Nuclear revenge. The colleague's payback. My colleague made a career out of stealing credit until the day the office finally paid him back. For 3 years, I watched him glide through meetings with a practiced smile, taking the bright ideas I sketched on napkins, the late-night fixes I pushed into production, and the recognition that should have landed on my desk. He was polished, persuasive, and impossibly liked by our manager. Me? I was the quiet engine, the one who stayed late, who corrected others' mistakes, who kept our project from derailing. I love the craft. I love getting things right. I never wanted drama. But small indignities accumulate like dust in corners. A passing great point credited to someone else. A phrase of mine repeated by him in front of leadership, and then applauded as if sprung whole from his mind. I learned to swallow the sting, to smile in meetings, and tuck my notes away. Yet the ledger of my patience kept balancing toward a deficit. The final straw was petty by most measures. A junior presentation where my prototype, months of quiet work, was presented as his casual triumph in front of a client. I saw the spark of recognition glide across the table toward him and felt something finish in me. The desire for redress was not about vengeance for spectacle. It was about restoring the simple truth of who had built what. I began to collect the evidence others had assumed didn't exist. Not to destroy him, to illuminate. I saved drafts with timestamps, log chat threads where my ideas were acknowledged, and then presented by him as offhand brilliance. And I tagged versions in our shared drive, so ownership would be impossible to deny. I started to document not only the theft of credit, but the small patterns that revealed a habit. Who he thanked in passing, which meetings he avoided when there were tough questions, which slides bore my phrasing word for word. I kept everything in folders named for dates and projects, not for melodrama, and I copied the items to a clean drive where the metadata spoke plainly. There is a paradoxical comfort in things that cannot be argued with. A file's timestamp does not flinch when someone denies memory. I wrestled with how to present the truth. There is a difference between exposing a villain and correcting a wrong within a professional community. I do not want a circus. I want a procedure. I sketched an approach in my head that married optics and fairness. A clear, calm presentation that let the record speak. I rehearsed lines that would avoid melodrama. Stick to facts, show comparisons, ask for clarification rather than demand punishment. There were nights I practiced the tone in the mirror, ensuring the strain of anger would not bleed into a performance that would simply look like a personal attack. My plan was to be precise. If I could be precise, the moral force would be carried by evidence rather than rhetoric. The building blocks of my reveal were intentionally mundane. Version history screenshots, email threads with explicit mentions of contributions, draft files showing incremental changes, and timestamps that trace the idea from conception to final slide. I added testimony, short, candid notes from a couple of colleagues who admitted privately that they'd noticed discrepancies but lacked proof. I avoided any temptation to embellish or manufacture cause. The truth, once assembled, had its own gravity. I knew that my colleague was not an antagonist in a storybook. He was a person who had adopted a pattern that worked for him, that made the process of documenting him feel less like vengeance and more like professional housekeeping. There was an internal theater to the waiting. He continued, smiling and charming, taking meeting space and applause, unaware of the archive I had been compiling. He even increased the frequency of his public gratitude, a tactic that both soothed other people's suspicions and sharpened my resolve. I took comfort in the quiet arithmetic of proof that the smallest log note could outlast a practiced smile. I refined my presentation not to humiliate, but to make the path of ideas and authorship traceable. Side-by-side slides, original drafts next to published decks, chat threads with time markers. The goal was not theatrical ruin, but correction. The strategy was to make correction unavoidable without being vengeful. The day I chose was painfully ordinary. Mid-week, a scheduled project review with our manager and HR attending for a separate compliance check. I bookmarked the meeting not because I wanted a spectacle, but because this crowded context would make ignoring a factual narrative difficult. I arrived with a slim laptop and a folder of exhibits that read like a small forensic report. I opened with a single sentence of calm. I want to present the development history of Project Orion so attribution is clear. I did not use incendiary language. I narrated. Slide by slide, I showed the draft, then the updated deck, then the chat where I had suggested a particular solution, and finally the slide in which that same phrasing appeared credited to my colleague. There was a hush in the room not because I raised my voice, but because facts have an attention-grabbing quality of their own when assembled coherently. I remember clicking through a timestamp sequence while watching micro-expressions, surprise, the twitch of discomfort, some guarded indifference. My colleague maintained a smile that grew tighter as the evidence accrued. I resisted triumphalism. My performance was surgical. I let the data do the heavy lifting. The manager's face moved from curiosity to concern. HR took notes. No one shouted. No one pounded a table. The power of the moment came from its ordinariness. This was a workplace governed by procedure, and I had translated an emotional injury into administrative terms. That translation made it actionable. It turned whispers into a reviewable record and private frustration into organizational responsibility. The most intense instant was not a blow, but a silence. After I closed the final slide, after the side-by-side comparison made clear the pattern, the room breathed as if surprised to find itself holding court. My colleague's composure cracked in a way that was almost invisible, a pause too long to be natural, a throat clearing. He asked a question that tried to redirect, about process, about intent. The manager asked for context instead, and HR asked for documentation to follow up. I handed over the folder. The effect was not dramatic in the cinematic sense. It was precise, inevitable, and surgical, and that made it sting in a subtler way. After the meeting, nothing exploded. This was not a movie finale. It was an administrative correction that rippled outward over weeks. Credit lines began to appear on plans. The manager instituted a simple practice of naming contributors on slide decks and in meeting notes. HR updated a small section on tangible attribution in our team guidelines. My colleague did not receive a cinematic downfall. Instead, he stepped back into a different rhythm, quieter, more cautious in meetings, careful with his attributions. Some relationships cooled. A few casual lunches evaporated. But there were also private apologies and acknowledgments from colleagues who admitted they had suspected something but never had the concrete pieces to act. The office culture tilted incrementally toward transparency. In quiet moments, I turned the experience over my mind. Revenge had looked at first like a possibility of theatrical harm. What I enacted felt different. It was correction through clarity. The satisfaction was not a gloating glee, but a relief that truth had been made traceable. There was irony in using the same instruments of our trade, documents, version histories, professional presentations, to deliver a kind of justice. It was a nuclear feeling only in the sense that the method had been thorough and unavoidable, not because it had incinerated anyone. I gained recognition for my work eventually, but more meaningfully, the team began to ask contributors to own their words. My position did not turn into a pedestal, but ordinary fairness, once nudged, had begun to take hold. He thought the storm had passed, that I'd had my little moment of satisfaction and moved on. But what he didn't know was that my silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. After the first meeting, the office atmosphere shifted like a quiet tectonic movement. The air was lighter around me, heavier around Ethan. He walked slower, laughed less, and kept his gaze low during briefings. To outsiders, it might have looked like the balance had finally been restored. But to me, it was clear he was plotting. That's what men like him do when a mask slips. They don't reflect or repent. They regroup. They calculate. And I wasn't naive enough to think he'd stop. I had exposed him once, and humiliation like that breeds a specific kind of hatred. Silent, smiling, and venomous. He started small, snide remarks about my obsession with documentation, quiet digs during team huddles, subtle gaslighting in front of new employees who didn't know the history. I saw it coming a mile away. I'd dealt with narcissists before, and Ethan fit the pattern like a glove. They don't attack directly. They corrode reputation drip by drip, whisper by whisper. His charm had taken a hit, but he was resourceful. He found new listeners, junior staff who wanted approval, the kind who laughed too hard at his jokes and mimic his mannerisms. I watched him build a new audience, carefully seeding a narrative that I was too rigid, hard to work with, a perfectionist who couldn't delegate. And I let him. I smiled, I agreed, I stayed quiet. Because every time he spoke, every rumor he planted, every email he crafted to undermine me, I was collecting. I had learned something from the first battle. You don't win by shouting louder. You win by waiting longer. Revenge, if it's to be perfect, needs timing like a symphony. Then came the golden opportunity, a merger. Two departments were set to integrate under a new director who didn't know either of us. New leadership meant new impressions, new hierarchies, and new vulnerabilities. Ethan saw it as his chance to rise again. I saw it as my chance to end the cycle, permanently. The new director, Ms. Reyes, was sharp, pragmatic, and allergic to drama. She valued efficiency above charm. Ethan didn't see that. He tried to charm her with the same tricks, flattery, confidence, rehearsed charisma, but I could tell from her expression that she wasn't buying it. She respected results, not smiles. So I played the long game. When a merger project began, I volunteered to co-lead, right alongside Ethan. It was the perfect trap. He couldn't refuse without seeming petty, and he couldn't sabotage me without risking exposure again. For weeks, we worked side by side, our rivalry hidden beneath layers of corporate civility. On the surface, everything looked smooth, polite emails, professional meetings, even small talk over coffee. But underneath, every word was a move, every smile a feint. I started planting seeds, not rumors but facts. Quietly, strategically. When Ms. Reyes asked for updates, I copied her directly on emails, ensuring credit was properly distributed. When Ethan tried to take control of tasks, I gently redirected him toward areas that looked important but were actually landmines of accountability: budget tracking, client follow-ups, system audits. He took the bait eagerly, desperate to prove his worth. I made sure every decision he rushed through had a paper trail leading back to him. The climax built slowly. One afternoon, he called a meeting with Ms. Reyes to showcase our progress. I knew he planned to exaggerate his role, to downplay mine, and to reclaim some of the spotlight he'd lost. What he didn't know was that the report he planned to present contained a subtle but critical flaw. The data he'd signed off on, without double-checking, was incomplete, based on outdated figures he had pulled from an old shared folder. I had intentionally mentioned the update in a team message he'd ignored. The difference wasn't visible at first glance, but to a trained eye like Ms. Reyes's, it would stand out immediately. The meeting started. Ethan was in full performance mode again, his voice calm and confident, hands gesturing just enough to command attention. He praised teamwork, innovation, and collaborative synergy. I sat quietly, taking notes, playing the role of the loyal subordinate. Then Ms. Reyes interrupted him mid-sentence. "Ethan, can you explain why your data references Q1 metrics? We're in Q3. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ethan froze. His eyes darted to me, then back to her. He fumbled. "That must be a versioning error," he stammered. "The data team must have," she cut him off. "The file you sent was last modified by you yesterday." Her tone wasn't angry, just precise. The kind of precision that leaves no room for escape. He tried to pivot, to charm his way out of it. But Ms. Reyes wasn't the type to be swayed. She turned to me. "Did you notice this discrepancy, LM?" I nodded calmly. "Yes, I did. I flagged it in the project notes last week and sent a revision suggestion in the share drive." She nodded once, her expression unreadable. "I see." The rest of the meeting went downhill for him. Every follow-up question revealed another corner he had cut, another detail he had overlooked. By the end, Ms. Reyes didn't even need to raise her voice. She simply thanked him for his input and told him she'd be reviewing leadership roles after the project concluded. The words hung in the air like a verdict. After the meeting, Ethan cornered me in the hallway, his voice low and trembling. "You did this," he hissed. "You set me up." I looked him straight in the eye and smiled faintly. "No, Ethan, you set yourself up. I just kept the receipts." He didn't answer. He just stood there, breathing hard, the realization settling over him like a slow, cold rain. Over the next few weeks, his decline was subtle but undeniable. He was left off key meetings. His emails were ignored. Ms. Reyes reassigned parts of his work to me for efficiency. He wasn't fired. She was too professional for that, but his influence was gone. The same colleagues who once echoed his words now avoided eye contact. The empire he'd built on stolen credit had quietly crumbled, piece by piece, without me ever raising my voice. The best part? I didn't have to celebrate. The victory was in the silence. Watching him fade, watching fairness quietly reclaim its space, that was enough. My revenge wasn't loud or cruel. It was elegant, inevitable, and absolute. And yet, sometimes when I see him across the office, quiet, distant, smaller, I wonder if I became too much like him to win. When I thought it was all finally over,
always leaves a
he
trace
tried
of
one
the thing
last
you were
move,
fighting against.
desperate, reckless, and cruel. But that's when my revenge became something bigger than payback. It became justice. Ethan's downfall should have ended there, but men like him don't know when to stop. After the merger project humiliation, he drifted in the shadows of the company. Not fired, not promoted, just stuck. And for someone who fed on attention, being ignored was torture. He wore the mask of professionalism, but behind it, resentment brewed like acid. Every polite nod, every email that didn't include him, every success of mine that went unnoticed by him, it burned. I could feel it from across the office, that quiet fury in the way he'd slam his drawer a little too hard or linger outside conference rooms he wasn't invited to. I should have ignored him. I should have let the silence swallow him whole. But then he made it personal again. It started with small sabotages. A misplaced file here, a corrupted document there. I caught them because I'd learned to double-check everything, and I knew his patterns. Then, one morning, an email was sent to upper management, anonymously, accusing me of misconduct and data tampering. The evidence attached was laughably bad. Forged screenshots, manipulated logs, an obviously fabricated timeline. But it was just plausible enough to raise questions. HR called me in for an informal clarification. I sat in that sterile room, watching the HR manager flip through fake evidence, my heart pounding not from guilt, but from disbelief. Ethan had actually tried to frame me. The HR manager wasn't unkind, but she was detached, clinical. We just need to verify these claims. It's probably a misunderstanding, she said, her tone rehearsed. I nodded, handed over my backup logs, and explained every inconsistency. Within a few hours, IT confirmed the tampering. The anonymous email had come from a disguised account, traced back to Ethan's workstation. When they told me, I felt something strange. Not anger, not even relief, just a calm certainty, like the world had finally placed the last piece of a puzzle I'd been building for years. They suspended him the next day, pending investigation. But suspension wasn't enough. He'd spent years bending truth, stealing credit, and weaponizing charm. And now, when cornered, he'd chosen deceit over accountability. I couldn't let him slink away quietly, paint himself as a victim, or rewrite history one last time. So, I decided to finish it. I didn't need to fabricate anything. I just needed to reveal what was already there. I gathered everything. All the files, messages, drafts, and meeting logs. Not just the ones about me, but the ones that showed how many people he'd quietly undermined. I talked to others who had been brushed aside, whose work he'd stolen or minimized. Turns out I wasn't the first. I was just the first who fought back. They shared their own fragments of proof, chat messages, misplaced credits, silent frustrations that had never been voiced out loud. Piece by piece, I assembled a timeline of his entire pattern. The promotions built on lies, the awards based on others' work, the manipulations disguised as leadership. It wasn't revenge anymore. It was exposure. Then I wrote a report, clean, factual, emotionless. I titled it Attribution Discrepancies, a documentation summary. I made no accusations, just data, screenshots, and verifiable metadata. It read like a case study, because that's exactly what it was. I sent it to Ms. Reyes and HR with a short note. You asked for transparency. Here it is. No anger, no gloating. Just truth, stripped of theatrics. What happened next wasn't cinematic. It was bureaucratic, slow, deliberate, procedural. They reviewed the files for a week. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Then came the announcement. Ethan was terminated for professional misconduct and falsification of records. No grand confrontation, no shouting. Just a formal email, company-wide, naming the reason. It was more powerful than any outburst could have been. Every single person who'd ever defended him, envied him, or believed his charm read that line. His legacy, carefully crafted over years, dissolved in one paragraph. He tried to contact me afterward. A late-night message, just one line. Was it worth it? I stared at it for a long time before deleting it. Because the truth was complicated. It didn't feel like triumph, not exactly. It felt like closure, heavy, quiet, inevitable. I hadn't destroyed him. He'd done that himself. I just handed him the mirror he'd been avoiding his whole life. But even after he was gone, his shadow lingered. The office had changed. People were cautious now, careful to give credit, careful to document their work, careful to acknowledge others. It was strange to watch justice reshape the environment. Meetings became more transparent. Recognition became shared, not stolen. For the first time, I felt like I belonged in a place that valued truth over theatrics. Yet, beneath that satisfaction, there was something else, an ache, a question. Had I gone too far? Was the calm I felt real peace, or just the exhaustion after a long war? A few weeks later, I found out Ethan had left the city. A mutual colleague mentioned he was freelancing somewhere else, trying to start fresh. I didn't feel pity, but I didn't feel hatred either. Just distance. Maybe he'd learned something this time. Maybe not. But for me, the lesson was carved deep. Sometimes revenge isn't fire, it's light. It burns not by destruction, but by illumination. Still, late at night, when the office is quiet and the hum of computers fills the air, I think about the cost. Standing up for yourself changes you. It sharpens you, makes you see the world in lines and evidence and silence. I used to love collaboration, ideas flowing freely, trust unspoken. Now, I triple-check every document, copy every file, protect every creation like it's a fragile secret. Justice has a way of hardening people, and yet I don't regret it. I think of all the times I stayed quiet when I should have spoken, all the times I let someone else take the credit because it was easier. I'll never do that again. Maybe that's the real revenge. Not the downfall of a liar, but the rise of the truth-teller. Because the truth, once uncovered, doesn't belong to anyone. It just exists. Immutable. Eternal. They thought my story ended when he was gone. But in the aftermath of my revenge, I learned that justice isn't clean, and sometimes the ghosts you create don't disappear when you win. After Ethan's termination, the company seemed to breathe easier. The tension that once pulsed through the hallways faded, replaced by something new, a cautious respect. Colleagues who used to look past me now made eye contact. They thanked me in small ways. A nod during meetings, a quiet good call after I presented. For the first time, my work was seen and not through the lens of someone else's performance. But recognition, I learned, has a strange taste when it's born from war. There's a quiet bitterness to it. Like winning a game you never wanted to play. For weeks, I felt hollow. My days were orderly, efficient, successful even, but something in me had changed. I caught myself double-checking everyone's tone, scanning emails for hidden motives, assuming deception where there was none. Trust, once fractured, doesn't heal easily. And the irony wasn't lost on me. I'd won, yet I no longer believe in the world I'd fought to fix. Still, I moved forward. Ms. Reyes noticed my work and offered me a new position, project supervisor for the department's innovation branch. It was everything I had once dreamed of: autonomy, influence, a team of my own. I accepted. I told myself it was time to build, not destroy. But even as I started assembling my team, the whispers began again, faint, uncertain, like echoes from another life. You know, she's the one who got Ethan fired, someone said once when they thought I couldn't hear. Careful with her. She doesn't forget. I laughed it off, but the words stuck. My reputation had transformed into something sharper, almost intimidating. I wasn't the hard-working one anymore. I was the dangerous one, the avenger, the one you shouldn't cross. At first, I told myself it didn't matter. Fear was still a kind of respect. But as time went on, I realized how isolating it was. People hesitated to disagree with me. They sugar-coated feedback, avoided debates, and deferred decisions. The irony was cruel. In fighting dishonesty, I had made honesty around me fragile. I became the person others tiptoed around, the quiet force in the room no one wanted to provoke. And it hit me. I hadn't just exposed Ethan. I'd inherited his shadow. I tried to change that. I made an effort to be open, transparent, collaborative. I praised my team's ideas publicly, credited their efforts religiously, and refused to take shortcuts. Slowly, they began to trust me. Not entirely, but enough to create something real. For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of what I used to love. That spark of shared creativity, the hum of collective purpose. But just when the calm began to settle, Ethan's ghost returned, not in person, but in rumor. One morning, I received a message from a former coworker. "Have you seen this?" Attached was a link to a professional forum where Ethan had posted a long, self-pitying essay under a pseudonym. Though it didn't take much to see who it was about. He didn't use names, but the story was unmistakable. A jealous colleague ruined my career through manipulation and lies. He painted himself as the victim, the misunderstood innovator crushed by corporate politics. The post gained traction fast. Sympathy, debate, speculation. A few users even guessed the company's name. At first, I ignored it. Let the noise die down, I told myself. But it didn't. The thread grew. People started connecting dots. My inbox filled with questions, some curious, some accusatory. Even Ms. Reyes asked for a word. Not angry, but concerned. "We know the truth," she said. "But perception matters. These things can spiral." She wasn't wrong. In the digital age, truth competes with narrative, and narrative usually wins. So, I did something I never thought I'd do. I wrote a response. Not defensive, not emotional. Just factual. I described the evidence, the investigation, the resolution. I didn't name him, but I didn't have to. My tone was calm, professional, unflinching. I posted it, then logged off. Within hours, the tide turned. People who had sympathized with him began retracting their words. Others dug into his history and uncovered inconsistencies. The thread that began as his final attack became his public undoing. Again, but this time, there was no satisfaction. Watching it unfold felt exhausting, like watching the same film play twice with no joy in the ending. I realized then that revenge is not a single act. It's a chain reaction. Once started, it doesn't stop easily. Each action breeds another consequence, another wave of tension, another chance to lose a piece of yourself. The company handled the situation quietly, issuing a statement clarifying events. The storm passed, but the damage to my peace didn't. Every notification after that made my pulse quicken. Every rumor felt like a spark that could ignite another fire. I had become hyper-aware, always prepared for defense. It wasn't power anymore, it was vigilance. And vigilance, if you let it, becomes paranoia. Then one night, after a long day of work, I found myself staring at my reflection in the office glass. The building was dark, everyone gone, my screen glowing behind me. I looked tired, older somehow, and I asked myself, not for the first time, had I gone too far? Had justice cost me the part of me that once believed people could be better? The next morning, I made a choice. I took a step back. I asked for time off, not to escape, but to breathe. For years, I had been fighting for recognition, fairness, truth. And I had won, yes. But I hadn't allowed myself to live after the fight. My identity had become defined by the battle itself. I needed to remember who I was before all of it. Before Ethan, before revenge, before the constant need to prove myself. I booked a train out of the city and left my phone on airplane mode. For the first time in years, I sat in silence that wasn't filled with suspicion or planning. Just quiet, the kind that feels like healing. And in that stillness, I understood something. Justice isn't supposed to consume you. It's supposed to free you. I had spent so long trying to fix one corrupt system that I forgot to protect my own peace. By the time I returned, things had shifted. The company moved on. New faces replaced old ones, and the story of Ethan and me became a distant office myth, a cautionary tale whispered to interns. I smiled when I overheard it once, half amused, half sad. They didn't know the weight of it, the cost behind the legend. But maybe that's how it should be. I built something new after that, not just projects, but trust. I mentored younger employees, helped them avoid the traps I fell into, taught them that recognition means nothing if it costs your integrity. And maybe, in some quiet way, that became the redemption of it all, turning a story of revenge into a lesson about resilience. I thought my revenge story was over, but years later, karma came back in a way I never expected. It wasn't about punishment anymore, it was about closure. Time has a strange way of dulling sharp edges. Years passed since that chapter of my life closed, yet sometimes I still caught myself looking over my shoulder, half expecting another storm. But life had quieted down. I had moved up in the company, leading entire divisions now. My name carried weight, not out of fear anymore, but respect. People trusted me, sought my advice, saw me as someone who fought battles and came out stronger. But deep down, I knew I hadn't completely let go of what happened with Ethan. It wasn't anger anymore, it was residue, the kind that clings quietly without asking permission. It was a random Thursday when the past found me again. I was walking out of a conference room after a long strategy meeting when my assistant handed me an envelope. "Someone dropped this off for you," she said, shrugging. No return address. No sender name. I almost threw it away until I saw the handwriting. It was unmistakable. Ethan. My chest tightened for a moment. My first instinct was disbelief. He hadn't contacted anyone from the company since the online scandal. Last I'd heard, he'd moved cities, vanished into freelance work, a ghost in the professional world. But the letter in my hands was real. I took it back to my office, shut the door, and sat in silence before opening it. The paper was folded twice, written neatly. It began simply, "I owe you an explanation." He wrote about the months after his firing, the spiral, the anger, the justifications he told himself. How he'd convinced himself I was the villain because it was easier than admitting he'd destroyed his own career. He described losing everything he'd built, moving to a small town, working at a repair shop under a false name just to survive. And then he wrote something I didn't expect. "For a long time, I hated you. I told everyone you were ruthless. But then, I realized you didn't destroy me. You exposed me. And that's not the same thing." He went on to say that therapy, of all things, had forced him to confront who he really was. The narcissism, the lies, the fear of being ordinary. He admitted that he'd read my later interviews, seen how the company had changed, and, surprisingly, how I'd helped mentor people, change policies, and build something positive. "I used to think revenge was poison," he wrote, "but maybe in your case it was medicine, bitter, yes, but it cured something broken." He ended with a sentence I never thought I'd read from him. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, just understanding, because I finally understand you." I sat there for a long time, staring at those words. My hands were steady, but my heart was racing. I didn't know what to feel. Relief, anger, pity, maybe all of it. The truth is, his letter didn't erase what he did. It didn't justify it, but it made him human again, and that, somehow, was more powerful than any apology. For days, I carried that letter around, folded neatly in my bag. I didn't reply. What could I possibly say? That I was glad he suffered? That I forgave him? Both felt dishonest. So I chose silence. Not out of hate, but peace. Because, for the first time, I didn't need the last word. Months later, fate decided to twist the story one last time. Our company got a new partnership deal, and I was invited to a networking summit, a 3-day event filled with executives, startups, and investors. During one of the sessions, I heard a familiar voice behind me. Not identical, but close enough to make my stomach drop. I turned around. Ethan, older, leaner, more subdued. His hair had grayed slightly, and his posture wasn't as arrogant as I remembered. For a moment, our eyes met. Neither of us said a word. He gave a faint nod, not a plea, not guilt, just quiet acknowledgement. And I returned it. That was all. Later, during a panel discussion, he spoke. I didn't expect him to, but his words caught me off guard. He was talking about integrity, accountability, and rebuilding after failure. He didn't mention me or our company, but I recognized his story buried between the lines. He spoke about the moment when truth becomes a mirror instead of a weapon, and I could see that he meant every word. People applauded him, and instead of bitterness, I felt something strange, pride. Not for him, necessarily, but for how far we'd both come from that battlefield of deceit. After the panel, we crossed paths once more in the hallway. He smiled, a small, humble smile, and simply said, "You were right." I nodded. "About what?" I asked. He thought for a second. That lies always catch up, but so does growth. Then he walked away, and that was the last time I ever saw him. That night, I stood by my hotel window, watching the city lights flicker. The whole encounter replayed in my mind like a movie fading to black. I realized that revenge stories don't end when the villain falls. They end when the hero stops needing to win, when they can finally rest. And I could rest now. For years, I'd carried the weight of proving myself, of punishing wrongs, of demanding justice. But true power, I learned, isn't about revenge, it's about release. When I returned home, I took Ethan's letter out of my bag one last time. I read it again, slowly, then tucked it into a box with other mementos from that chapter of my life. Old badges, project plans, photos from the office. And then I sealed the box shut. Not to forget, but to close the loop. Because closure isn't forgetting, it's choosing peace over pain. A year later, during a mentorship session with new hires, one of them asked me, "What's the most important lesson you've learned in your career?" I smiled and said, "That truth always wins, but make sure you're still standing when it does." They laughed softly, but I meant it. The truth will outlast revenge. It always does. Sometimes I still think about Ethan, not with hate, not even with pity, but with a quiet understanding that both of us were necessary parts of each other's story. Without him, I wouldn't have learned what integrity truly costs. Without me, maybe he'd never have faced himself. Life has a cruel symmetry like that. Now, when I see someone being mistreated at work, I don't seek revenge anymore. I seek resolution. I use what I know to make the system better from within. Because power isn't in striking back. It's in changing the game so no one else needs to. And maybe that's the real ending. Not fire, not fury, but transformation. Revenge was the catalyst, but peace was the reward. The storm that once consumed me became the rain that made everything grow.